हेलो। हाँ जी आशा जी।
हाँ, स्टार्ट करें। आई थिंक
Yes, yes, yes.
अंशुल जी भी आ गए हैं।
Jaya is today's moderator and you are the panelist. Jaya, you can start the program.
So good evening, everyone. We all welcome you all on behalf of Team CASA. So Shri Sumit Garg ji has started with this initiative, and this is a wonderful initiative, this certificate course on direct taxes. This will help us understand the complex taxation issues which we face in day-to-day cases and transactions. So this is a very good initiative on from this Team CASA. So I will ask Shri Sumit Garg ji to say a few words and.
Thank you, Jaya, for welcome to all participants and my elder brother CA Anshul Kumar Singhal ji sir. Once again, welcome to you on this platform. Today we are going to discuss income from other sources and taxation issues in income from other sources. As we are completing 5-day series, today is the 4th day, and day after tomorrow, 5th day, we are going to discuss taxation issue in tax audit by CA Dr. Rakesh Gupta ji. So once again, welcome to all participants. I hope all are satisfying, and CA Asha Sharma and Sachin Sinha ji is doing great job for as a panelist for taking interaction on all the issue. And I request Jay ji to give brief about the total speaker before starting the program.
So in this 4th session of this certificate course, we have Sri Anshul Kumar Singhal ji with us as an expert. He is a very prominent speaker and has a great exposure in direct taxations and international taxation. He will help us understand the today's topic with the help of his practical experiences. He will elaborate how the this taxation of income from other sources is getting complex these days, day by day, and how can we forget this TDS, which is actually becoming tedious day by day. So हम अंशुल जी से रिक्वेस्ट करेंगे कि प्लीज सर आप आज के सेशन में हमारे को इलैबोरेट करिए इन टॉपिक्स के बारे में, एंड प्लीज हेल्प अस अंडरस्टैंड दीज कॉम्प्लेक्स टॉपिक्स एज अ केक वॉक. So, and there is no doubt that you will definitely help us understand these topics. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jaya ji. And I'll start my presentation. Just give me a second to share the screen.
Sure.
And participant, today's topic is income from other sources, and TDS issue will be deferred because this chapter is already so long, so will not be justified to cover both the topics. And definitely we will plan one more session on the TDS compliances issues. So over to you, Anshul bhai.
Thank you, Sumit ji. Thanks a lot. So today, as Sumit ji said, that we will be discussing income from other sources, and although the heading is other sources, but in no way it is other. It is actually the main discussion points today. Means there are a lot of litigation going around in various aspects of income from other sources. We'll discuss a few of them. And today what I have planned is that we'll go to the basics of what is income from other sources all about. We'll talk about section 56, which is the basis of charge. We'll talk about section 57, wherein we get some deductions against the income from other sources. And we'll also talk about section 58 and also 59, which is a very small section. But 58 will discuss what are the deductions not allowable from the income from other sources. So let's get started straight away from basis of charge under section 56. So first of all, subsection 1 of section 56 talks about the basic provisions of how and what kind of income can be taxed under the provisions under the head income from other sources. So first of all, let's read this language of the section. It says income of every kind which is not to be excluded from the total income under this act shall be chargeable to income tax under the head income from other sources if it is not chargeable to income tax under any of the heads specified in section 14 items A to E. So what we can see here is that there are two prime conditions of taxing a particular income under section 56 and under the head income from other sources. What are those? The first is that income is not exempted from taxation. So first of all, we all understand that 56 and the income from other sources is a residuary clause, means whichever income is not taxable under any other head can get taxed under section 56. But please mind that section 56 is not a catch-all section, means it cannot happen that any and all kind of incomes which are not taxable under the other heads can get taxed in section 56. So what first and foremost condition is that under the provisions of Income Tax Act, this income, whatever is going to be charged under section 56, should first of all be a taxable income. It should get covered under the definition of income, the total income. It should be chargeable to tax under the provisions of section 4 read with section 5, right? All those chargeability criteria must be met, and only after the chargeability criteria is met and it is not covered by any other head of income, which is income from salaries, house property, PGBP or capital gain, then it will come under the provisions of section 56. So in a sense, it is residuary, but a limited residuary clause. So what are the heads of income in A to E, which we all know? Income from salaries, income from house properties in clause C of 14, section 14. So clause B has been omitted, so it is blank as on date. E is capital gains, F is income from other sources. Then how it is going to be taxed? First of all, we have understood that there are two basic conditions which need to be fulfilled for an income to be taxable. The other important criteria is that whatever method of accounting you are following to tax income, such method you can opt for income from other sources also. Say for example, if a company is paying income tax on a mercantile basis, right? So the income from other sources will also get taxed under the mercantile basis system. So we cannot opt for a cash basis system if we are offering other incomes on accrual basis. So whatever is the method of accounting, say for example, many partnership firms or chartered accountant firms are offering income on a cash basis of accounting. So in that particular scenario, the income from other sources will also be offered to tax on a cash basis of accounting. However, one thing that we must need to note is that if we are following mercantile basis of accounting and we are offering income on such accounting system, then income computation and disclosure standards will also apply to income from other sources. So income ICDS is basically applicable on two incomes. One is income under the head PGBP and the other is income under the head other sources. And condition applied that the income must be computed under the mercantile system of accounting and not on the cash basis. So wherever cash basis is followed, ICDS has no application. So therefore, we must be careful that whenever we are computing income from other sources, that also need to comply with the provisions of ICDS. Now, subsection 1 was very generic section, but now subsection 2 moves on to certain specific items of income which they have to cover, which might not have been covered under the generality or which might not have been covered under the charging sections of earlier times. But as and when the law progressed and as and when the government came to know that there are some loopholes where the income is being not subjected to tax because of certain, evasions happening or certain kind of transactions which are being used to do money laundering, those kind of provisions were brought in, and gradually section 56 became longer and longer day by day. So we'll cover all the clauses of section 56 subsection 2 and see that what kind of incomes are chargeable. So how subsection 2 starts, it says in particular and without prejudice to the generality of provisions of subsection 1, means subsection 1 is independent and subsection 2 is independent in its operation. So Subsection 2 says it's without prejudice to the applicability of subsection 1. The following incomes shall be chargeable to income tax under the head income from other sources. What are those income? First one is dividend. So one thing we must note is that dividend income is to be taxed under the provisions of income from other sources, whatever be the business of a company or an SSC. Say for example, if a company is engaged in the business of trading of shares or making investments in other companies, and they are offering the gains on sale or purchase of shares and securities as business income, even in that case, the dividend income which is earned from such shares, say for example, during the holding period of those shares, a dividend is declared and dividend income is earned. Even in that case, when the other incomes from such sale and purchase of securities is being offered to tax under the head PGBP, the dividend income will keep on getting taxed under the provisions of section 56 because it is specifically mentioned here in subsection 2. So therefore, in no case dividend income can be taxed in any other head of income. Then there is second clause which talks about winnings from lotteries, crossword puzzles, races, card games, gambling, entertainment show, game show is also covered. So all kind of, you see in TV there are shows which are reality shows, or there is KBC or any other kind of game show which you are playing on your mobile, or any other game which you are playing, and if you are winning any amount of sum from those games or entertainment shows or crosswords, there are newspaper crosswords, there are puzzles wherein you have prize monies announced on that. So all that amount will be taxed under the income under the head income from other sources. Also, there is a specific section which talks about the tax rate on such income, which is section 115BB, and the tax rate is flat 30%. So we must be careful while taxing these income that there is no slab rate allowed. It has to be taxed under the flat rate of 30% plus surcharge and cess as the case may be applicable. And in fact, the TDS, the person who is making the payment of this winnings, the organizers, whenever they pay you the money, they also deduct a 30% TDS on a flat rate. Then you come to sum received from employees as contribution to any PF, superannuation fund or ESI fund or any other fund for the welfare of employees. Now you would wonder that this kind of income is already taxed under the provisions of section 36, right? In one of the clauses, it is mentioned that whenever you receive any sum from your employee, right, towards the contribution of any superannuation fund or PF, then that income, that amount received becomes an income in the hands of the employer. And we have to make the payment before the due date in that particular act prescribed in the act, so as to claim the deduction under section 43B. And there has been a clarification also. Now, the question which arises here is that why this particular income is written here also in subsection 2 of section 56. Can somebody let me know why this income is mentioned here? I would be happy to know. You can write your messages in chat box if you want to. So let's make this session interactive, and the participation of participants is very, very important in order to, have a lively session.
So I would request all the participants to type their queries in the chat box.
Okay, so not an issue. Probably I have not got any response.
So one query is there.
Query is there, okay.
Yes. So I think, although this is not directly related to the current topic, but I'll still raise this query. If NRI transfer his immovable property to resident of India, then under which form he will get the permission from RBI?
So this is related to FEMA, not related to other sources. So we'll probably deal with it in some other session. Today, let's focus on income from other sources and the Income Tax Act. right? So basically what happens is that when a company or a taxpayer is engaged in business and they in the due course of running their business receive the contribution from employees, then it is classified as income under the section 36, right? But when you are not a company or an SSC which is running a business, say for example you are a charitable trust or you are any other kind of entity which is a not-for-profit entity, in those particular scenario, when you are not offering your income as chargeable to tax under PGBP head, in those scenario, this particular receipt of contribution from employees will be chargeable to tax under section 56, right? And it will be allowed as deduction also when the same is paid. Then the other income is interest on securities, rental income from machine or furniture, rental income from plant and machinery or furniture along with building. So first one was rental income on machinery or furniture. The other one is when it is rented out along with the building itself, wherein the furnished building is given on rent. Then it says any sum received under keyman insurance policy, including sum allocated by way of bonus and gifts or receipts without inadequate consideration, subject to certain conditions, which we will discuss separately. Now, one important thing you will see is there is a star mentioned here. There is a star mentioned along with certain items of income which are covered under section 56. There is a star. So what you find here is that interest on securities. Just I mentioned that there may be certain companies which are engaged in the business of share trading and they earn interest on CCDs or some other security forms. Then there can be companies who are engaged in the business of rental of income of machinery or furniture. There are so many new startups which are coming and they are providing furniture on rent. So in those scenarios, how would we classify that whether it should go to PGBP or other sources? Similarly, rental income, co-working spaces, they are providing you rent, building on rent with entire furniture and everything. So what would happen? Will it go to PGBP or will it go to other income? Similarly, any sum received under a keyman insurance policy, right? Including any sum by way of bonus. So this is also an income which is taxable under section PGBP head. So the star is for mentioning that this section 56 provides for an exclusion that these income will be chargeable to tax under section 56 only and only if this have not been charged under the head PGBP. So only if you are not in the business of renting, say you are into business of something else and just by virtue of certain circumstances you were to let out your building or you were to let out your furniture. In fact, if you let out building, probably it will also get covered under the income from house property. But if you are giving a furnished premises along with rent, right? The rental income of plant and machinery or furniture along with rent. So what it says is that you might have to bifurcate between the rent which you are getting for building and the rent which you are getting for the plant and machinery and furniture. So that bifurcation of rent which pertains to furniture and plant and machinery, only that amount will get taxed under income from other sources. Similarly, a keyman insurance policy, say for example, the person is not your employee. The person, if it is an employee, if the person is an employee, the sum which is received might get taxed as salary. But say for example, the person is only a director with no employment contract and the company has taken a keyman insurance policy for which the proceeds are given away to the employee or to the director. In those circumstances, the income might get covered under the income from other sources and not under the other heads. So that is where the specific sections of specific provisions of subsection 2 apply. There are certain other items also which are covered under subsection 2, which we will cover in the ensuing slides. Right? There are other heads. There are certain other income chargeable under this head due to deeming fiction provided in some clauses. which we will discuss in coming slides.
So before moving to the next slide, there is one question that sum received from employees is other income or not?
Sum received from employees, it's towards the contribution, which we see now that the contribution 12% is the employee contribution and 12% is the
Right.
employer's contribution.
Right.
So whatever is the employee contribution, sum received from employees as contribution to PF. So when I receive the contribution, it first becomes my income, and then when I pay to the statutory authorities as a contribution, then I claim it as a deduction, right?
Okay.
So that is where the sum received from employees as contribution first becomes income, and then I claim an expense. It is the same case in the PGBP also, when where there is an amendment in this act, where if you would remember in PGBP, there were many cases which said that if employees contribution is not paid within the due date as provided in those act, not before the due date of filing of return. So if the due date of those act is breached for depositing the amount, that amount was to be as a dead expense that could not have been claimed at any point of time. But there were certain cases led by ML ruling of Delhi High Court, which said that no, the provisions of this section 36 will also apply in a similar fashion so as to 43B, and the expense can be claimed even if the expense has been paid to the statutory authorities before the filing of tax return. So this is a similar kind of provision which has been brought in section 56, right? I hope this is clear.
Yes, sir, it's absolutely clear now. I hope Mr. Dheeraj Joshi was also able to connect with it.
Yes, probably if he's having further question on this query, he can write and we can answer it in
Sure, sir.
coming slides, right?
Yes, sir.
So now we talk about two of the very important subclauses of section 56(2), which are not operational now, but which have relevance because ultimately they were operational till 1st of April 2017. There can be many cases, litigation going around these clauses. So we'll try to understand that what were the provisions of this section, this clauses, and how the taxability arose in these clauses. So first one was clause 7. It was applicable to receipts by individual or HUF. So what it covered was a sum of money, means if you receive cash or money is directly in your bank account, which exceeded 50,000 rupees in aggregate in the entire year, then it would be chargeable to tax. We'll discuss each line by line item in coming slides. So we are just referring to the brief pointers. Sum of money. The second is immovable property. If I receive immovable property as a gift, that also becomes taxable. Third thing is property other than the immovable property, which is kind of movable goods or various items which are listed in the act itself. So we'll discuss what are the properties also. Similarly, a clause 7A was provided in section 56(2), which referred to only receipt of shares by a particular company, and that too without consideration or less than fair consideration. So in those circumstances, clause 7A would apply, but it applied only to firm and company, not to anybody else. So these were the two clauses which are not operational now because they have been subsumed in clause 10X, clause 10 of section 56 subsection 2. There is a new section, a new clause which has been inserted with effect from 1st of April 2017. And now all these provisions have been clubbed and put together in clause 10 itself, right? Yet there are certain clauses, there are certain definitions which are provided in these clauses only and which have been referred to in clause 10. So therefore it is important to understand these provisions also before we move on. So now let's discuss clause 7 in detail, which is applicable to individuals and HUF. What it says, first item of income was sum of money, which is cash or bank receipts, If it is without consideration, means you have not supplied any good, not supplied any services, and you have just received it as a gift, then it is called without consideration. And where the aggregate value of such sum received exceeds 50,000 rupees from all the parties. So for example, if there are 10 people who have gifted you 10,000 rupees each, so in an aggregate, I have as a recipient received 1 lakh rupees, then the amount of such money will be chargeable to tax as other income. Similarly, moving to the next item, it is immovable property. Now, immovable property has to be seen in consideration with stamp duty valuation. So wherever we have the recipient receives the immovable property without any consideration, then the stamp value shall be treated as the fair value and the amount will be taxable in the hands of the recipient. However, the stamp value duty must be exceeding 50,000 rupees. So now we might think that in today's date, where can it be a case that the immovable property is costing 50,000 rupees, less than 50,000 rupees, but it might be a case in smaller pieces of land in rural areas where it is not an agricultural land or immovable property, but there can be circumstances where the value is lower than 50,000 rupees. So we have to see the stamp value. If it is more than 50,000 rupees and the recipient has received it without consideration, then the entire stamp duty value shall be considered as taxable income. Then the second point is, if we have paid a consideration, means if recipient has paid certain consideration, but that consideration is less than the stamp duty value, then in that case also there will be certain amount which gets taxed in the hands of recipient of such immovable property. What is that amount? Now that amount needs to be seen by reducing the consideration paid from the stamp duty valuation, means stamp duty valuation minus consideration paid for the property. If that amount exceeds 50,000 rupees, then the amount will become taxable. And what amount will become taxable? The amount which is in excess of stamp duty valuation of the consideration paid. So the stamp duty valuation, which we call in general terms as circle rate, the circle rate prescribed by various state governments of various locations, they generally prescribe it, is available freely on websites. So we have to see what is the circle rate, and if the consideration paid is less than the circle rate, then that amount used to get taxed. Now there is a clause of 10% variation which has been put in, but that has been put in clause 10 of subsection 2. But when these clauses were operational, means clause 7, there was no a gap provided that you can play with that gap. That was not there at that point of time. However, it also mentioned, the provision also mentioned, that if you have entered into an agreement prior to the date of transfer, which is generally the case, we enter into an agreement and the transfer generally happens after 3 or 4 months or 5 months, it may take some time. And during that course, the circle rate enhances, right? So to cater to that particular situation, it was provided that if you have paid any sum on or before the date of agreement, and that was not paid in cash, means it was paid by any other mode other than cash, then that amount, the circle rate on the date of agreement can be considered for considering the taxable income, for calculating the taxable income. So you need not consider, you need not take the rate, circle rate as on the date of transfer itself, so as to compute the chargeable income. Therefore, this is a beneficial provision which has been provided in the Act, right? So in order to cater to the price rises because of the time lag between the agreement and the transfer which happens. So this is, we talked about immovable property. Now moving on to the movable property, similar kind of thing. If it is received without consideration and FMV is exceeding 50,000 rupees, then the entire amount of 50,000 will get taxed. Now please see that 50,000 rupees is not a exemption limit. Means just, for example, we have 2.5 lakh rupees of exemption limit, that the slab rate starts after that. But in this particular case, 56 section, the 50,000 rupees is a limit. If it is below 50,000 rupees, nothing is taxable. If it is more than 50,000 rupees, everything becomes taxable. The entire amount becomes taxable. So it is not a kind of deduction which we take from, say for example, if we have earned 2 lakh rupees of gifts, though it's not that 1,50,000 will be taxable. The entire 2 lakh rupees of sum will be taxable, right? So similarly, in the case of movable property, if it is received without consideration and the FMV is exceeding 50,000 rupees, then the entire amount of FMV will get taxed. Obviously, there are certain prescribed methods in 11UA. Rule 11UA provides for various methods of how to calculate the fair market value of different items of property. So that we can consider. And according to that computation, whatever amount comes will become a income chargeable to tax under the head income from other sources. Similarly, if it is for less than consideration of 50,000 rupees, the excess amount, if it is the consideration is less than the fair market value. So the difference between fair market value and consideration, if it is more than 50,000 rupees, then the amount will become taxable. Now, this clause 7 itself provides for definition of property, and it means immovable property. Obviously, immovable property is covered, which means land or building or both. And the other items are shares and securities, jewelry, archaeological collections, drawings, paintings, sculptures, any work of art or bullion. So you see that this property is defined. If there is any other property which is not covered in this particular list, say for example, rights in shares, right? When a right issue is brought by a company and one of the shareholders refuses or transfers the right to some other shareholder or to a new person. In that case, if I transfer it for free, and if the other person who is receiving it for free will not become taxable under this section, because the right to shares is not a property listed in this section. Therefore, there can be many other properties or list of items which can be received for free without giving rise to chargeability of tax, right? I hope we are clear. There are some questions around. There are 2 questions, I think, Jyoti. Money received from father as gift is also taxed here. Sir, we'll talk, Jyoti ji will talk about the exclusions. Just give me a couple of minutes. Suresh Kumar Jain, he is asking, sir, there is negative income under the head income from other sources, and that is interest received is less than the interest paid because of loans are used for the purpose of business, whether it is deducted from other sources of income or not. Sir, interest, we will talk about section 57, which talks about the deductions which you can claim under the income from other sources. So if you have earned income from other sources, there are certain deductions prescribed under section 58, which you can claim. And if by claiming those deductions, your income turns negative, obviously you can claim that loss.
Thank you, sir, for taking these queries.
So moving on, now we'll also talk about SDV, stamp duty valuation of immovable property. There is a proviso 1 to clause 7, which talks about that if there is a dispute to the stamp duty valuation, so many times what happens is the circle rate is very high, but the actual transactions which are happening in those locations is at a quite lower price than the stamp duty valuation, the circle rate. And there can be a genuine situation where two independent parties are dealing with each other, and the actual price of the property is much lower than the circle rate. In those scenarios, what the taxpayer can do is they can dispute the stamp duty valuation, and once this is disputed, the AO may refer the valuation to valuation officer. Now it has to be done under the provisions of section 50C, And 50C also applies because 50C talks about immovable property transfer without consideration where the capital gains arises to the transferor, right? So in case the transferor gives the immovable property for a less than fair value consideration, then in those scenario, the transferor is also chargeable to tax as well as the recipient is also chargeable to tax. So in one transaction, there can be two persons who may have to pay taxes on the same amount, right? So therefore, whenever in 50C, the amount is disputed, this stamp duty valuation is disputed, you can always approach the AO. So this is a typical difficult situation which generally arises. How we suggest our clients is that you have to dispute the amount with the registrar of properties. So when you go to the registrar of properties, you have to dispute it. The circle rate has to be disputed there by filing an application where you mention that the actual price of this property is much lower than the circle rate, and therefore we must be charged stamp duty at the actual price of the transaction rather than the circle rate. Obviously, many a time, most of the times the registrar do not entertain such applications, but yes, there are ways and means by which you can agitate it before the courts, you can go in writ. However, once you have disputed it, you also give rise to your right under the Income Tax Act, so as to say that yes, we have disputed the stamp duty valuation and now we will not offer the income on the stamp duty valuation circle rate, but we must get a fair valuation done from the valuation officer, and it is not open for the assessing officer to have a discretionary view. Once the stamp duty valuation is disputed, the assessing officer is bound to refer it to a valuation officer. But yes, it might happen at the stage of assessment proceedings. So this is something which is very, very common, which we face day in, day out. Whenever there is a transaction which is happening at a lower than circle rate value, this is one important point which must be kept in mind. Therefore, otherwise, if this is not considered, this chargeability to tax will be at the circle rate only. Section 155.15 has been omitted, so I'm not talking about that particular section as of now. So what is stamp duty value? It means the value adopted or assessed by or assessable by any authority of central government or state government for the purposes of payment of stamp duty in respect of immovable property. So in case we are able to convince the stamp duty authority itself that the actual price is the actual consideration is the circle rate itself, and you should charge the stamp value on that rate itself, then your circle rate or the stamp duty valuation for the purposes of Income Tax Act will automatically become that value, right? So you will not have to go by the circle rate. The amount on which you have paid the stamp duty is the amount of which needs to be considered for purposes of section 56. Now moving on, the exclusions which we just talked about. The exclusions that for individual and HUF, if they receive certain amounts from certain parties or under certain circumstances, those gifts or sum of money are not to be considered as income under the section 56(2)(7). What are those? First and foremost is from relatives. I have created a full flow chart of what a relative means as per the definition provided in this clause, and we'll just discuss it in the next slide. So please bear with me till the time we come to that slide. Now there is a question which I want to ask. As we all know that we generally celebrate birthdays, and on the birthdays, an individual gets a lot of gifts and sum of money as a shagun. So on that amount, whether a person will be liable to pay income tax under the head income tax other sources or not, just please write yes or no in the chat box. This is a very easy question. Say for example, a sum of rupees 1 lakh is received in aggregate on the occasion of birthday of an individual. Whether it will be chargeable to tax under the head income from other sources or not? No. 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 Ankit ji saying no. Sunil ji saying no. Suresh ji is also saying no. Sir, any other responses? We have many participants. We have almost 32 participants here, 42 participants here. No. Shubham ji is saying no. Jyoti is saying no. Anybody else? I'm waiting. Let's have some more responses. Let's have some more responses. On the occasion of birthday, a person receives 1 lakh rupees. I think everybody is saying no as of now. Rajesh ji is also saying no. Sanvi ji is saying no. Let's see what the section says. There's one more no. Sahil ji is also saying no. Let's see what is the exclusion. It says if sum or property is received on the occasion of marriage of individual only. It does not talk about the occasion of birthday. So if you receive rupees 1 lakh in aggregate of Shagun on the occasion of birthday, the amount is going to be taxable. It is only one time opportunity in your life at the time of your marriage, whenever you can receive gifts on the occasion of birthday, which is a yearly event. The government does not want to give any loophole to create opportunities for money laundering, right? So in those particular circumstances, occasion of birthday is not covered. So any sum of money or gifts received on the occasion of birthday will be liable to tax under the head income from other sources. So the answer is yes. Relative is another thing. I'm talking about general. Relative is obviously covered under clause first clause, right? Clear. Suresh is saying clear. Great. Let's move on. Then the other exclusion says under a will or by way of inheritance. So if you have inherited certain property or under a will, it will be exempt. Or in contemplation of death of the pair. Say for example, if a person is on the deathbed, they have been diagnosed with certain critical illness, which is expected to end the life of person. And during that course, the person gives away the gift. In those circumstances, the recipient of that particular gift will not be taxable, because that is considered to be akin to a will or by way of inheritance. So it may happen that the person was diagnosed with a perpetual illness or kind of an illness which does not have a cure, but by God's grace, something might happen. The person revives from that situation. Even in that case, the income will not get taxed. Whatever happens later on, so you must have proper documentation in order to say that the person who gifted that amount of sum or property was on the deathbed, or he was contemplating death, and in that course only the amount of gift was given. Only in those circumstances you will be able to claim an exemption, not otherwise. From any local authority, say for example, local authorities give you certain benefits or certain perquisites or certain cash incentives in times of floods, in times of certain natural calamities, those kind of amounts are exempt. From any fund or foundation or university or other educational institution or hospital or other medical institution or any trust or institution referred to in clause 23C of section 10. So you might receive any scholarship, you might receive any kind of gifts or any kind of prizes from these universities while you're studying. In those circumstances, any amount received, but that has to be registered under clause 23C of section 10. Only those, if you're receiving gifts from those institutions, only that it will be exempt. If you are receiving any fund from a charitable institution, obviously charitable institutions give away funds for free, and these are generally for persons who are in need of it. So in those circumstances also you'll get an exemption. A gift by way of transaction not regarded as transfer under the following circumstances, which is business reorganization and the scheme of amalgamation or demerger. So because these are specifically exempt under section 47, this will also not get taxed under the head other income. Now we'll come on to the definition of relative. So this is the chart which you need to just consider and refer to whenever you are discussing or you are dealing with a situation to judge whether the amount received from a person is chargeable to tax or not. Now, what are the relatives defined? Under clause 7 only, there is a definition which has been provided of relative, and there are many definitions of relative provided in different sections. So when we are dealing with clause 7 of subsection 2 of section 56, we need to deal with the definition of relative provided in this subclause only, and not to definition provided anywhere else in the act. So in this particular definition, there is an individual, a spouse, individuals, brothers and sisters of the spouse, father and mother of individual, brother and sisters of father as well as of mother. These are all considered to be relatives. Then the lineal ascendant and descendant of individual as well of the spouse. Now you would say, okay, boss, what is this? Spouse and individual will have independence, same lineal ascendants or descendants. Probably descendant may be same, ascendants may be different, because there will be one line of ascendants here and one line of ascendants here. So this might be different, but how can this be different? So this might happen in a situation where there is a case of remarriage, when the spouse had offsprings from earlier spouse, but now he or she marries somebody else, and in those circumstances the other person, the individual, might not be the biological parent of the lineal descendant, but because the spouse is the biological parent, even in those circumstances the descendants will be considered as relatives of individual, right? So now you have seen that what are all the relations which are covered. So one of the very important discussion points which generally come up for consideration is that whether a parental uncle or a maternal income can gift to a bhatija or a niece, right, or a nephew. So obviously a paternal uncle or maternal uncle can gift the money, but if you would see, the children of brother and sisters of spouses or the individual are not covered. The lineal ascendant and descendant of brother or sister are not covered. So what it means is that although you can gift the money to nephews and nieces, but you cannot receive the money from them. So when the money is flowing from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, मामा जी ने भांजे को दे दिया, चाचा जी ने भतीजे को दे दिया, वो कवर्ड है. ऊपर से नीचे आ सकता है, लेकिन नीचे से ऊपर नहीं जा सकता, right? So money, if it comes from here, say for example brother or sister had sons or offsprings, and if they pay the money to individual, that amount will become taxable. They are not covered in the definition of 56. Say for example, many times what happens is we generally pay good amount of sums to paternal aunt, the बुआ जी को हमने अगर गिफ्ट दे दिया एक अच्छे अमाउंट का, तो बुआ जी के हाथ में वो टैक्सेबल हो जाएगा, राइट? या मामा जी को दे दिया तो मामा जी के हाथ में वो टैक्सेबल हो जाएगा. तो इन द रिवर्स केस सिनेरियो, बुआ जी ने हमें दिया तो वो टैक्स नहीं होगा, राइट? There is one query which says 1 lakh is aggregate per pair. No sir, it is not per pair. When we are talking about receiving money from non-relatives, it is the aggregate of sum received from all non-relatives, right? So if, as I had said an example, if I receive a sum of rupees 10,000 each from 10 persons who are not my relatives. In that scenario, the total aggregate becomes 1 lakh rupees, and that entire 1 lakh rupee will become taxable, right? And we are talking about non-relatives. So on this slide, we are talking about relatives. What are relatives? So there is one query from Suresh ji which says, brothers, wife and sister's husband are covered under relative under section, which is a section I am not able to read. Under this
56,
section.
sir. 56.
No, sir. In this particular clause, spouse of brother and sister are not covered. Right? Brother and sister of spouse are covered, but not their spouses. So obviously what you can do is, this is a very simple planning. If you have to receive money from or gift from spouse of your brother or sister, the spouse can first give a gift to their spouse, right? Means your brother or sister. And then they in turn, your brother and sister can give gift money to the individual. So this can be planned, means this is not such a big situation. Right? So I think the definition of relative is clear, and you will find this flowchart relevant whenever you want to refer to the definition of relative.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you for taking the query.
Now, we discussed whatever amount is taxable in the hands of individual or HUF. Now we move on to firm or company. And company, here the company means not being a company in which public are substantially interested. So I'm not going into the definition of this public are substantially interested, because this is a generic definition, which it means listed company, which is publicly traded. And wherever this company receives certain shares, this is not, that scenario is not covered in this particular section. Basically, the idea is to cover those companies which are closely held, right? Which are private limited companies or public limited companies which are closely held, which are not traded as such. And also, when you saw individual or HUF, you saw many items listed there. It was immovable property, there was cash, it was archaeological gifts or bullion or jewelry or many other things. But in case of firm or company, this particular subclause 7A only covered shares, and that too shares of a company which is not a company in which public are substantially interested, right? So if a company or a firm receives gift of publicly traded company shares, those items are not covered here. So what is covered is a company or a firm receiving shares of another closely held company. That is covered. And when it is covered that when the shares are received without consideration and the fair market value of such shares exceed 50,000 rupees, then the fair market value of such shares will get income which is liable to tax. Or if the recipient has paid certain consideration, but the fair market value of those shares exceeds the consideration paid by a sum of rupees 50,000 rupees. In that scenario also, the difference will become taxable in the hands of the firm or company receiving the shares, right? So you would also recall that there is a section 50CA which talks about taxability of capital gains in the hands of transferor if the shares are transferred at a price lower than the fair market value. So in a similar situation, when we talked about immovable property, here in case of shares also, the transferor as well as the transferee get charged to tax in different heads. The transferor gets taxed under the capital gains, and the recipient of shares get taxed under the head income from other sources. So therefore, this was basically done to avoid gifts. There were a lot of transactions which were happening wherein the shares were being exchanged without consideration and no capital gain tax was being paid. And to avoid those kind of situations, this particular section was amended and this particular clause was brought in. However, as I mentioned, that all these clauses have now been subsumed in clause 10, but yet we are just reading and understanding these clauses because they are still relevant. Many case laws and litigation are still going on. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular this clause also does not apply to transfer under section 47, which are exempt under 47, and which generally talks about amalgamation, business reorganization, and demerger. Right? Now, how to compute FMV? FMV of shares has to be computed. The method is prescribed under section 11 UA sub rule 1, rule 11 UA sub rule 1. So the income which has to be computed in terms of transfer of shares, then you have to refer to sub rule 1, whereas we will now in the coming slides discuss the fair market value in cases where the company issues share for a premium. In those circumstances, sub rule 2 is to be referred. So what is the difference between sub rule 1 and sub rule 2? Sub rule 1 generally focuses on NAV value, net asset method value. So what it means is that whenever you are transferring, say I am transferring the shares to somebody else, person A, and say for example, the per share value, the net asset value of a share as per the books of accounts is 100 rupees. Say for example, a face value of 10 rupee share is having a net asset value of 100 rupees. Now, I as a prudent person will transfer the share not below 100 rupees. Obviously, I might not get a price according to the discounted cash flow method, because those are based on valuations, projections, estimations of future financial projections. So in those circumstances, the government understands that whenever I am transferring the shares or somebody is receiving the shares, means I am receiving the shares, then whatever I need to pay is at least bare minimum the net asset value of the shares. Beyond that, whatever I pay, it is nothing to worry about. If the NAV is 100 and I am paying only 80 rupees, then the difference of 20 rupees will become taxable in my hand as income from other sources. Right? So I think it is clear that income from other sources will be chargeable to tax in the hands of recipient of shares if the consideration paid is less than fair market value. So generally you will have to refer to 11 UA1. And also when you will refer to rule 11 UA sub rule 1, there is no mention of taking a valuation report. You are not mandated to obtain a valuation report either from a merchant banker or from a chartered accountant. There is no mention, because the NAV, the formula of NAV has been provided in this particular sub rule 1. So you have to calculate the NAV according to that rule, and you can transfer the shares on that NAV or a price higher than NAV, and it will not trigger any chargeability to tax of income in the section 56 nor in section 50 CA. Right? I think we are clear till now. Is there any query for transfer of shares? Because now we will move on to the issue of substantially premium, issue of shares on premium. Everyone is clear? Great. So this is basically when a company issues shares at a premium and the premium is higher than the fair market value. What was happening is that government came to know that most of the money laundering was happening through this route. A very nominal number of shares were allotted or issued to a particular person, and the valuation was huge. The premium used to be taken at a very, very significantly higher value as compared to the fair value of those shares. Even if the company is not doing any business, they are holding certain property or they are holding certain shares, or it might just be a dormant company. They will come up with a business plan and say that you invest money in us at a high premium, which will dilute the shareholding to a very minimal extent, but bring in the money at a very high denomination, because this was a route to do money laundering. That is what the government claims. And in order to plug that route, what they said is that if you receive the share premium and the share capital at a price which is much higher than the fair market value, then that excess of consideration over the fair market value shall be considered as your income from other sources, right? So we'll talk about more on this particular issue, but let's see what are the exceptions. The exceptions are that if you are receiving money from venture capital undertaking, from a venture capital company, or from a venture capital fund. So why the government exempted them is that generally they are investing in startups, or they are having their own means and mechanism, and venture capital funds or undertakings are governed by many other regulations also from SEBI and other regulators. So therefore the government thinks that in these circumstances there is a much lesser chance of doing any wrongdoing. Therefore they have exempted these entities. Also, the second item is a company from a class, means when a company receives amount from a class or class of persons as may be notified by the central government. So one of the classes, or the only class which has been notified, is the startups, the registered startups with the DPIIT. So whenever you have registered as a startup and you are issuing shares at a premium, you will not get taxed. There are certain conditions to it. We'll talk about this a little later. Now, how the FMV is to be calculated? FMV, if you would see, in the case of transfer of shares, we discussed about sub-rule 1 of Rule 11 UA. But at the time of issuance of shares at a premium, the valuation methodology is prescribed under sub-rule 2. And sub-rule 2 primarily discusses the discounted cash flow method also. So it gives you an option to value the shares on discounted cash flow method along with the net asset value method, right? So it gives you both the options. Why it gives you both the options is because when you are issuing shares to an investor, when the company is receiving money, there can be many business objectives, there can be strategic investments which are happening. And those strategic investments can be judged more competitively by using discounted cash flow method rather than using net asset value method, because net asset value method is a historic method, historic way of valuing a company, which means that whatever the company has done till date, that NAV method captures only that particular aspect of valuation, whereas discounted cash flow method looks into the future. What is the future potential of a company? So whenever a shareholder is diluting their shareholding, they might have to look at what is the potential of the company. And here the scenario is different. The person who is receiving the money, right, the company is getting taxed. Whereas in the case of transfer of shares, the person who was receiving the shares was getting taxed. So it is a reverse case scenario. So whenever the person who is receiving the shares, and when person was required to make a payment of the consideration, there they put up the cap at the lowest possible price. Means that whatever is the NAV is actually something which is the value of the share, and therefore government thinks that you cannot go below that. Whereas when the company is receiving share capital from a particular person, an investor, they have given you an option to create the valuation at the maximum possible value by using the potential of the company by using the discounted cash flow method, right? So therefore this is the fundamental difference between these two provisions. Now because the company is receiving the money, also it says that there is another clause which says that as may be substantiated by the company to the satisfaction of AO based on the value on the date of issue of shares. So what it provides that even though if you are not able to value the company shares on the basis of method prescribed under 11UA subrule 2, even then you can have a different methodology used, but you will need to satisfy the AO that the methodology which was used other than the NAV or the discounted cash flow method was the most appropriate methodology to value such shares. Now, probably the valuation people who do valuation may come up with certain other valuation criteria. Say, for example, many times you see that valuation are done on the basis of users, the number of users you have of an app. Say, for example, there is an app and the downloads are happening at a very rapid pace and the company crosses 1 million downloads, 2 million downloads. Many times it might not be very feasible to project the financials, and you might not be willing to use the discounted cash flow method, but you might be willing to use the criteria of downloads, that whenever a million of download is obtained, the value will go by a particular number, a particular threshold. So I'm not a valuation expert. I'm just trying to give examples that what can be the different scenarios where you can have other methods used other than the discounted cash flow method and NAV. And in those circumstances, there is an option given here, because discounted cash flow mechanism may also not be able to predict the future or capture the entire valuation. Therefore, the government has given you a leeway that you go and satisfy the AO and prove the fair value of the assets. And if the AO is satisfied, that fair value will be considered for the purposes of taxability under section 56(2)(7)(b).
Sir, there are some queries in the chat box.
Let me complete this one.
Okay, sir.
So you will see that this was angel tax. So now whatever is higher, whichever value is higher, you can consider that, and then you can compare the share premium with this particular valuation. And if the share premium is not higher than this valuation, then you are safe. Yes, yes, ma'am. We can have the queries.
Yes, sir. So first query is whether there is any monetary limit with respect to the gift received from relative.
Nahi hai. There's no limit. You can receive unlimited amount of money from your relatives, provided that the relative must be as per the definition.
Yes, sir. And the next query is that the section 56(2)(7)(b is what is the date of applicability of this section?
Applicability, that I need to check, but it was, I think, in somewhere came in 2012. It came by Finance Act 2012. So it should be applicable either from 2011 or 2012, either of these 2 years, right?
Yes, thank you.
I think it was the famous Finance Act of 2012 when Pranab Mukherjee made many changes, and this was also one of those changes.
Okay, sir.
And whenever you are reading this, I would recommend that you please go and read the memorandum and the finance minister's speech of this particular budget. And I'm almost 99% sure that this was Finance Act 2012, because it gives the background why this particular section is being brought in, why this clause is being brought in. It is specifically mentioned that there are cases of money laundering, right? And therefore, in order to prevent those transactions, these particular provisions are brought in. Why we refer to those clauses is, many a times we see that there are two shareholders, existing shareholders of a company, and they are infusing money at a premium. And then the assessing officer in the assessment proceeding say that no, this is higher than the fair market value. And many a times it happens that these companies are not startup companies. These are mature companies having operations from last 20-25 years. And the new fresh share capital was to be introduced. In those circumstances, what happens is that there is no money laundering happening. The existing shareholders are putting in money. They are known people. They have their KYC. They can fairly show and demonstrate the source of their income from where they have invested money. In those circumstances, there is no point in just doing the hard line of an act and saying that no, you have to prove it through a discounted cash flow mechanism only. So in those circumstances, we generally take a plea that there is no money laundering involved. So when there is no money laundering involved, the intention of legislature was not to capture such transactions within the purview of this provision. So therefore, it is very much recommended that you please read the memorandum and the finance minister's speech for this particular budget.
Anshulji, I have a query.
Yes.
Are there any notified class of companies? Like
Yes, there
in
are.
your previous, which kind of
Startups.
startups? And in case the startup does a valuation and they issue a share at a price higher than what is coming in the valuation, fair market value. So will there be any taxability for that difference amount?
No, there will not be, but they have to meet two conditions. This is the condition which I mentioned. This is provided under the DPIIT notification number CSR 127E. I have also provided a link. There is a link to this. Means if you click on here, you will get to the notification. What it says is this provides basically the specified class of person. This notification is notifying the startups, wherein the startup which is registered with the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT, which we call in short. And there is a twin condition. First of all, you must be registered. And secondly, you must file a declaration in Form 2, a signed declaration in Form 2 on the portal of startupindia.gov.in itself. It is not to be filed with the income tax authorities. It has to be filed with the DPIIT only. And this is an online uploading of the form. What generally Form 2 talks about is, it talks about the ultimate use of the money which you have received as premium, as share capital. It brings in certain restrictions. What are those restrictions? I'll just brief you. That you cannot invest in immovable property, you cannot invest in jewelry, bullion, or car of value more than 10 lakh rupees. You cannot invest in certain other items. There are 8-9 items listed in Form 2. The shareholders have to declare that yes, we agree that whatever money has been received as a share capital, which might be in excess of the fair market value, will not be used in these particular assets, for purchasing these particular assets. It also includes shares and securities. However, there are certain exceptions. Say, for example, if the company is engaged in the business of letting out, or engaged in the business of sale and purchase of immovable property, sale and purchase of jewelry, or sale or purchase of your other items. In those circumstances, there are certain items which have been excluded, and which say that if because of your business you are investing in those inventories basically, then we'll not consider it to be a violation. However, if you would see that those exception of inventory also does not cover bullion or shares or securities. You cannot deal, you cannot be in the business of trading in shares and securities. That is not covered. You cannot be in the business of dealing in bullion, trading of bullion. So that is also not covered. So you must be very careful. The persons, the founders have to sign this Form 2 and upload it. Once this is uploaded, you are free for entire period of your startup duration, which is the definition of startup as provided in the Income Tax Act, as well as in the provisions of Startup India program, which talks about the limit of 100 crore of turnover, the reserves and surplus of 25 crore, or the paid up capital of 25 crores, or the tenure of 10 years from the date of incorporation. All those conditions must be satisfied. Once you satisfied everything, the provisions of clause 7B shall not apply. So this is the class of persons which has been notified under the second exception, right? So I hope this makes it clear.
So there's one more query, that whether amount received from non-residents will be covered in this section or not.
It will be covered. It will be covered, and it will be covered in both the scenarios. Basically, if there is a relative outside of India and the relative is gifting you money, someone's mobile is ringing. So I was saying that under the provisions of FEMA, if you are eligible to receive, and if you are receiving it from relative, it will be covered under the exception. But if you are receiving gifts from a non-related person, non-relative, then definitely it will be covered under the provisions of section 56, subject to the thresholds prescribed here. Right, but you also need to check the FEMA regulations before receiving gifts, because there, to my mind, there are certain limitations of receiving gifts from non-related parties and non-relatives. Also, please see that the relative as defined in FEMA might be different from relative as defined in section 56, right? So if a relative is defined for the purposes of FEMA and you receive gift from them, but the person is not covered as relative under the definition of Income Tax Act, this clause 7A, which we talked about, then that money will become taxable. So therefore, the definition of relative needs to be read carefully in both the laws, FEMA law and the income tax law. Right?
Okay, sir. Thank you.
So now moving on, if you are not a startup company, if you are a company other than the persons notified, and if you are not receiving money from venture capital fund, then what are the controversies which arise generally? The first and foremost is whether the AO can change the method. Say, for example, when I was valuing my company before issuance of shares, I used discounted cash flow method. And most of the time we see that AO says, no, you are discounted cash flow method, I don't accept, I will apply NAV only. They invariably go for NAV and just change the method. So whether AO is empowered to change the method on his own, first question. Second question, obviously there might be certain variations in the projections which were made at the time of receiving share capital and the actual numbers which happen at a later point of time. So when the assessments happen, generally a period of two years is generally there. Obviously it will reduce in time to come because the law has changed. But generally it happens that at least 18 months are taken. And in prior years, at least 24 months or 30 months were taken before the completion of assessments. At that point of time, the AO had already got the privilege of seeing the actual performance of the company and comparing it with the projections which were used at the time of issuance of shares. And most of the times it happens that there are variations. Now, whenever there are variations, the AO generally rejects the valuation reports and say that because there are variation, I do not consider your application of DCF method as appropriate, and therefore I'll use my own method of NAV. This is also one of the logics given to apply NAV. So now what is the jurisprudence on these particular issues? So I have put down some case laws which are prominent case laws on these particular issues. First one is Mantram Commodity. It is a case of Delhi Tribunal, and it says when the statute provides for a particular procedure, the authority must follow the same and cannot be permitted to act in contravention of the same. The tax officer has no power to do valuation other than the method prescribed in Rule 11UA 2 of the rules. So it says that whenever the assessee has chosen a method, the AO is not empowered to change the method according to his own sweet will. He has to follow the method which was adopted by the assessee. In Vodafone M-Pesa also, it said, the Bombay High Court said that the AO is undoubtedly entitled to scrutinize. Obviously, they will scrutinize, but they are not entitled to change the method. They say that, however, the basis has to be DCF valuation only. Say, for example, if the assessee had chosen DCF valuation method, then the AO will also have to use DCF valuation method only. They cannot just switch on to the NAV. Obviously, you can change certain parameters, logic parameters, if the assessing officer feels that the assumptions taken at the time of projections were not correct, right? Or there needs to be some variation in the assumptions taken. The assumptions may be tweaked with certain logics, with adequate logics and reasonings given in the assessment order, and only then it can be changed. But the assessing officer, this particular judgment said, assessing officer is not empowered to change the method of valuation itself, right? Similarly, in Rameshwaran Strong Glass also, the same view was taken where assessee company determined FMV of shares issued at a premium on the basis of DCF method in accordance with Rule 11 UA2, read with subsection 2, section 56(2) clause 7b, and the valuation report was prepared as per the guidelines given by the ICAI and no fault was found in the same. The tax officer was unjustified in changing the method of valuation of shares to NAV method. And they just cannot disregard the DCF valuation method. Many times I have seen orders where they just disregard it. They say that we do not accept DCF valuation because it was on the basis of projected valuation, projected financials. So in all those circumstances, you can take recourse to these judgments and argue the cases before the appellate authorities. Similarly, in the case of Cinestan Entertainment, same view was taken. Assessee company has an option to do valuation of shares and determine FMV either on DCF method or on NAV method. Tax authorities cannot examine or substitute their own value in place of the value so determined. Right? Now we come to one contrary ruling, which is generally relied upon by the assessing authorities. This is in the case of Agro Portfolio Private Limited, and it is now almost 3 years old, pronounced by Delhi Tribunal. What happened in this particular case was that the merchant banker has blindly relied on the projections given by the assessee, and they had not applied any kind of mind on those projections or the assumptions which were provided. And it was the assessing officer was of the view that the assumptions and the parameters used for computing the value as per DCF method were way away from the actual reality. I mean, the projections might be different, but the assumptions, the underlying assumptions of your business should be some reasonable assumptions. It should not be that we will go and touch 100 crore rupees of turnover in 1 year without any basis. Obviously, there might be some basis of touching 100 crore revenue in 1 year, but those assumptions and parameters need to be a little bit aligned with the actual reality. So in such cases, the Delhi Tribunal held that AO might be forced to reject the DCF method and instead adopt NAV method. So this is one of the very few rulings, and after this there are many other rulings. As you would see that all the rulings which we have discussed are pronounced after this ruling of Delhi Tribunal. They say that NAV method could not have been replaced, but AO will definitely quote this ruling in your assessment order if this challenge is there. You need to be careful of how to deal with it. So whenever we are doing valuation for shares at the time of issue of share capital, at least as a valuer, one must look at the assumption, the underlying parameters, whether the business has the capacity to project the to leap to those kind of projected financials which are being portrayed in the financial projections. So therefore, as a chartered accountant, as a professional, we must also look at the fairness and the reasonability of the underlying assumptions. And there is a case of TUB Rainland. It also says right of the assessee company to select method of valuation or not, nor has the officer dismissed the choice of valuation. Means the officer did not challenge the method of valuation, but what it said was the tax officer examined the parameters adopted by the company for valuation of DCF method. In this particular case, the assessing officer did not reject the DCF valuation, but challenged the underlying parameters used for projecting the financials. And by challenging those parameters, he changed the method to NAV. So in those circumstances, the Bangalore Tribunal held that where the assumptions are absolutely far away from the actual reality, and they could not have been used for projecting the DCF financials, DCF projections. In those circumstances, the AO was justified to change the method. So please see, here the tribunal is not saying that you have to do DCF valuation, but according to the changed parameters. In this particular case, the tribunal allowed the AO to change the method. So you are seeing that there are divergent rulings. Most of the cases are saying, the judicial precedents are saying that the AO is not empowered to change the method of valuation. The AO is only empowered to change the underlying parameters, the assumptions. But if the assessee has used DC valuation, the AO is also required to use DC valuation. But there are a couple of cases which have relied, which have decided in the favor of the tax department, and by using these particular rulings, the challenge is generally made during the assessment proceedings. Similarly, in case of VVA hotels, where the variation between value of projected revenue and actual revenue was marginal, and further there was no material to hold that company's projected revenue was fabricated, impugned change of method of valuation of shares was unjustified. So ultimately, you will see that this is a fact-finding procedure of something which is related to the fact. So the more stronger facts you have, the more chances are that you will be able to defend your case before the authorities or before the appellate authorities. I hope it is clear till now. I would be happy to take queries.
Yes, sir. Currently, there are no queries.
Great. Let's move on. Now, these are small clauses which talk about interest on compensation or enhanced compensation. Whenever you transfer certain immovable property or there is a compulsory acquisition which happens and government pays you compensation. So, and compensation is delayed. Many times the compensation is delayed and the courts or the government on a suo motu basis provides you with an interest compensation, interest on such compensation or interest on enhanced compensation. Many times the valuation of the immovable property acquired under a compulsory acquisition goes under litigation, and the case is decided after many years, 10 years, 20 years. And at that point of time, if an enhanced compensation is granted, the court also generally directs that an interest components need to be paid. So the litigation which used to happen on that particular amount of interest was that the people, the recipients of such interest used to say, claim that this is a capital receipt which is not chargeable to tax because it was related to transfer of a particular asset, immovable property, and this interest is nothing but a compensation towards the deprivement of my rightful money. So they used to say that because this arises from a transfer of a capital asset, the money which is being received is also capital in nature. In order to remove all those ambiguities, this provision was amended and inserted that interest on compensation and interest on enhanced compensation will both be clubbed and they will be charged to tax under clause 8. Also, there is a deduction of 50% because obviously there are litigation costs. There generally are many other costs related to realization of this money. So that government said that you cannot just take any kind of deduction. They limited the deduction to 50%, and it is a flat deduction. You need not provide any document. You need not have incurred actual expenditure. This is a deemed deduction which has been provided, just like a deemed deduction of 30% of expense against income from house property. So this deduction is provided under clause 4 of section 57. So this deduction is not provided in the section 56. So many times what happens is that section 57 is least referred to, and whenever the income is being offered to tax under section 56, we forget to claim the deduction of 50%. Therefore, please be careful that a flat deduction of 50% can be claimed against interest on compensation and interest on enhanced compensation. Right? So moving on, we come to forfeiture of advance received. We all know there were a lot of cases where people would agree to transfer a capital asset, an immovable property, and take receipt advance against it. And then at a later point of time, they will just forfeit the money and say that because it is a capital receipt, it is not chargeable to tax because it was received under an agreement to sell a capital asset. And this was very rampant. till few years ago. So by virtue of this amendment, insertion of clause 9, any amount which is received against against a transfer, a proposed transfer of capital asset, and if such sum is forfeited and the negotiations do not result in transfer of a capital asset, then that amount has to be charged to tax under section 56. Now what happens is that if this amount has been taxed once, but at a later point of time, say in 1 year down the line, the negotiations restart with the same party, and the same party says that I have already paid you this amount of money, right, as a consideration, so this needs to be adjusted against the consideration, and then in the coming year you transfer the share at a transfer the capital asset at a price minus the consideration which has already been received. So now you will not increase that consideration again because that has already been taxed in earlier year. So therefore, in order to avoid double taxation, this proviso has been inserted in section 51, which also is applicable in clause 9. Now we come on to subclause 10, which is the overall umbrella section clause now for receiving of gifts or sum of money or immovable property or property. And now this has replaced clause 7a and 7, which we just discussed. Now what it says is, because we have discussed it in detail, the principles of taxation are almost similar, almost kind of identical. Sum of money received without consideration where an aggregate value exceeds 50,000 rupees, the whole of the aggregate of value is taxable, right? Then immovable property, similar. If the stamp duty valuation exceeds 50,000 and the immovable property has been received without consideration, it is not taxable. Obviously, the exceptions of relative, exceptions of other kind of exceptions which are provided in those clauses are also provided in clause 10. Then the second thing related to immovable properties, if the consideration paid is lesser than the stamp duty value, and the amount of difference exceeds 50,000 rupees, then that amount becomes taxable. However, there is a limit. There is a 10% gap or 10%, which we can say window, which has been provided in order to see that the consideration is within the range of 10% of the stamp duty valuation. Then we can say that there is no other income which will arise. So how, let's understand it from an example. Say if the sale consideration of an immovable property is 90 lakh rupees, then the stamp duty valuation should not be more than 99 lakh rupees. So the 10% window has to be considered by virtue of sale consideration and not of the stamp duty valuation. See, for example, in this particular case, say the stamp duty valuation was 1 crore rupees. Now, if you compute 10% from 1 crore rupees, the threshold would be 90 lakh, right? So if you transfer it above than 90 lakh rupees, the income should not have been taxable. But we do not have to see the 10% threshold from the perspective of stamp value, but from the perspective of actual sale consideration. So in this particular case, when we will see 10%, we'll see 99 lakh rupees. And if the stamp duty valuation is within that 99 lakh rupees, say for example 97 lakh or 98 lakh or till up to 99 lakh rupees, there will be no additional income which will arise. However, if it crosses even 1 rupee more than 99 lakh rupees, the entire 9 lakh 1 rupee will become taxable. Therefore, we need to very carefully apply the bracket or the window of 10%. Also, we must see that this particular clause applies to any person, right? Earlier we read either it was applicable, certain parts were applicable to individuals and HUF, certain parts were applicable to firm and company. Now it is not so. Everything applies to everyone. which we call any property other than a movable property, the same thing applies. If it is without consideration and FMV exceeds 50,000, entire FMV will be taxable. If the FMV exceeds the sale consideration by a margin of 50,000 rupees, then that excess of FMV will become taxable. Now, as I said, that certain definitions have been picked up or been referred to clause 7 itself. So the expression of assessable, fair market value, jewelry, property, relative, stamp duty value, these all terminologies have to be seen and read from clause 7 only. So these are not separately defined in clause 10. They have just referred it. And kind of exceptions of gift received from relatives, from on the occasion of marriage, on all those exemptions which were provided there are also provided in clause 10. Right? So this here we end at the basis of charge. As of now, do you have any further queries on basis of charge? We'll consider now.
No, sir.
Otherwise,
As of
we'll
now,
move forward.
There are no queries.
Great. So let's move forward. Now we come to deductions. In the case of dividend, there is a specific deduction mentioned, which says in case of dividends or interest on securities, any reasonable sum paid by way of commission or remuneration to a banker or any other person for realizing such dividend or interest can be claimed as deduction. However, when the Finance Act 2020 was amended, it provided that dividend income will now be taxable in the hands of shareholders. It came up with a restriction of the expense which you can claim against the dividend income. It specifically provided that in terms of dividend income, you can only claim expense which is in the nature of interest, right? Here you see interest. Only interest expense can be claimed, and that too only up to the extent of 20% of the dividend income. So if you have earned a dividend of, say, for example, 1 lakh rupees, you can only claim a deduction of interest expense, that too up to only 20,000 rupees. If you have incurred expense to invest in shares, right, and if you are incurring an expense of, say, 60,000 rupees, the deduction will be limited to 20,000 rupees only. And also there is no carry forward of the balance amount to next year's. It is not that the balance 40,000 can be carried forward to next year's and can be claimed against the dividend income in the future years. That is also not the case. So whatever is the excess amount will become a dead loss. Also, this particular limitation of 20% and interest expense applies on income in respect of units of mutual fund specified under clause 23D of section 10, or income in respect of units from specified company defined in explanation to clause 35 of section 10. So in these circumstances also, if you are earning any income from units of mutual fund or a specified company, in those scenarios, the interest, the expense will be limited to 20% and only for the interest expense, nothing else. Obviously, there is a deduction under section 80M, which is a separate deduction, which you can always claim. If the company has received dividends from subsidiary company and the company also declares dividend further up to its shareholders, the deduction under section 80M, subject to those conditions prescribed therein, can also be claimed. That will not be considered as deduction under section 57. Right. The other significant deductions under section 57 is income from the family pension. So it provides either 33%, 1/3 basically, 1/3 of the family pension, or 15,000, whichever is less. Whichever is less, please consider whichever is less. So 15,000 is the maximum amount which you can claim as deduction. Any other expense of revenue nature, if you have incurred any other sum of revenue nature as an expense, that also can be claimed, provided that it has been incurred wholly and exclusively for earning such income, for the purposes of earning such other income. In that case, you can claim the deduction of any other revenue expense also. And needless to say that for deduction against dividend income, this will not be allowed. So wherever there is a specific restriction, this any other revenue expenditure cannot be claimed. Right. So now moving on to section 58, which talks about deductions not allowed. What are the deductions not allowed? Personal expenses, interest and salary paid outside of India on which TDS has not been deducted. And please ensure that interest and salary has to be such which is specifically, exclusively and wholly incurred for earning other income. Only then it was allowable. First of all, it has to be allowable, and then it says that although it was allowable under section 57, but we will not allow you the deduction if you have not deducted TDS thereon. Then the second says, subsection 1A says 30% of sum payable to resident if TDS is not deducted, and wealth tax. These are clauses of clause 1A and 2A, IA and 2IA of clause A of section 40. So although section 40 is under the head PGBP, applicable for computing the income under the head PGBP, but section 58 1A has borrowed those provisions and specifically mentioned that whatever amount is referred to in these clauses will not also be allowed as deduction under against the income from other sources. Then subsection 2 says provisions of section 40A, payments in cash, payments in other than mode of check, or your income tax. There are so many deductions which are not allowed as deduction and referred to in section 40A, that will also not be allowed as deduction under section 57. 58.3 talks about 44D. Whenever a foreign company is earning income from royalties or fee for technical services, which is chargeable to tax or which is governed by the provisions of 44D, in those circumstances, if it is not covered under PGBP head, it might happen, very, very rare circumstances. But if in the foreign company is not in the business of providing earning royalty incomes and they are just one-off income and it is being offered to tax under other income, then section 44D will also apply. Provisions of section 44D will also apply. Also, no deduction shall be allowed of expense incurred in relation to income earned from lotteries, races, gambling, or those shows which we talked about, entertainment, game shows. No kind of deduction shall be allowed against that particular income, which was chargeable to tax at the flat rate of 30%. However, there is one exception to subsection 4, which talks about that if the person is in the business of maintaining race horses, horses for running them in race horses, then you can claim deduction of expense. And horse race means where a horse race where the wagering or the betting can be legally done under the provisions of Indian laws. So if you are maintaining horses for such kind of horse races, then you can claim the deduction of expenses. This was it for section 59 or 58. 59 says, it talks about section 41. The provisions of section 41 have been borrowed in 59. Say, for example, if you have claimed a deduction of expense in year 1, right? But you have not paid it off. It was on the basis of accrual system. In year 3 or year 4, you get to know that you are not required to pay this liability and you write it back. In that circumstances, when you write it back, there is no provision in section 56 which brings that income to tax. So therefore, section 59 provides that whatever is the income in the nature of as is covered in section 41, if the same similar circumstances arises, that will also become taxable here under section 59. Right? So this is how we need to tax the income from other sources. That's the basic provisions of section of the income which is generally chargeable to tax under the head income from other sources. So that is it from my side for today. I would be happy to take further queries, and there can be many issues regarding relatives, regarding payments received under the lotteries, or the tax rates are sometimes specific. So we need to take care of all these items and comprehensively read sections beyond section 56 also. So please do not restrict yourself to section 56, because many times we lose deductions under section 57. We have seen many taxpayers not claiming deductions under section 57, just as the 50% flat deduction of interest on compensation. So therefore, we need to look at this particular head as holistic as we can, and then apply the chargeability of income. I'll be happy to take queries if there are any.
Jaya, if any query you can take up, all
I think
participants are
there are
requested
no queries as of now. So
Yes, sir.
Okay.
friends, if you have any query, please feel free to write it down, or you can just allow them to speak also. We can have some interaction.
Sure, please, I would request all the participants to raise your queries, and you can directly speak to the expert also, Mr. Anshul Singhal ji. So, please, अपनी queries पूछिए.
Okay, I think either I was too clear or I was not at all clear.
No, so the first was, I mean, applicable. आप बहुत ज़्यादा अच्छे से deep में आपने बहुत अच्छे से समझाया हम लोगों को, practical examples भी दिए, और कैसे law पढ़ना है, कैसे हम लोगों को फाइनेंस एक्ट के डीप में उसकी स्पीच वगैरह मेमोरेंडम पढ़ना चाहिए टू अंडरस्टैंड द इंटेंट ऑफ द लॉ. So that is very important to understand the actual implications of any section. So the session was very nice, sir. Very I mean, the slides were very self-explanatory, and आपने जिस तरीके से explain किया was wonderful.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. It was my pleasure, and I must thank Sumit Ji for keeps organizing such wonderful series of sessions for the benefit of profession. Means I would just say that I myself read so much to prepare for this section, and I got to know so many more things, because many times we kind of skip off things. So therefore, while reading this particular head of income, there were a lot of insights and new things which I got to know. So thank you, Sumit Ji. Thanks a lot for organizing these sessions and for giving me an opportunity to interact with the participants and to present my views on this particular subject.
Thank you, Anshul ji, for your wonderful deliberation, and I hope every participant is satisfied. And we will share the presentation tomorrow along with the video recording. Thank you, Sunil Gupta ji, and thank you all participants. Thank you, Sunil sir, Anshul ji, once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.